Definition one would be a permanent covering of water sitting on top of those hills. Definition number two would be a fall of rain on top of those hills, adding up to 22 feet. The third possible definition is a run of water over those hills of 22 feet or more. You say, well, wouldn't it have been nice if Moses, the author, had told us which of those three definitions we should go with? The reason why I don't think the text identifies which of the three we should go with is it really doesn't matter. Pick any one of those three, you get the same result, the destruction of humanity at that time. If you've got 22 feet of water permanently remaining over all the hills, then you're not going to be able to tread water for 1 year. So that's going to kill off everybody who's not in the ark. On the other hand, if you got 22 feet of rain falling within a brief period of time, likewise there will be no survivors. A good piece of evidence for that is a storm that took place in India where 4 feet of rain fell in one day. Again, total destruction, no survivors. And here we're talking quite a bit more rainfall than that. The third scenario, can you imagine 22.5 feet of water running at you as in a flood, say at 30 miles an hour? What happens when 22 feet of water comes charging at you at 30 miles an hour? Again, given the civilization of that time, no survivors, so it doesn't really matter. However, we can rule out the first one. It's not a permanent covering, simply from what the text tells us about the extent of the flood. The text tells us where the water came from. Chapter 7 of Genesis tells us that the water came from the underground aquifers and the rain clouds. Genesis 8 tells us what happened to the water after the flood. And he uses 4 different Hebrew verbs to describe the receding of the waters. The most significant of those verbs is the verb shub, which tells us that the water returned from whence it came by natural means, which means the water of the flood is still here. Now, why that's significant, if you want a global flood, you have to increase the water content of planet Earth by 5 times what it is right now. Which means you're really talking in a scenario of God grabbing water from, say, the galactic arm of our galaxy, dropping it on planet Earth and sending it back to the Orion galactic arm. Well, the text rules that out. It tells us the water came from earthbound sources and returned to earthbound sources. So there simply isn't the water to make it happen. Now, people who push a global flood, and I'm sad to say that the majority of the evangelical Christian community is still pushing this provably incorrect interpretation of Genesis, they will rebut that charge by saying, well, we realize there isn't enough water, but what God did is He supernaturally eroded all the mountains down to zero during the 40-day rain, and then during the year afterwards, He used plate tectonics to bump the mountains back up and to drop the ocean basins down to 60,000, or down to 38,000 feet. Well, the total amount of plate tectonic activity you're demanding there exceeds 60,000 feet. This is taking place within a little less than 1 year, and I've already felt by direct experience what happens when the ground moves up by 2 inches. More than that, I've had a few situations where it just went up by ½ an inch. 2 inches of ground movement taking place in a short period of time was enough to destroy the furniture in our home. I can't imagine Noah surviving 60,000 feet of plate tectonics taking place in less than a year. In fact, some geophysicists have done a heat release calculation. Just the heat alone released from that degree of plate tectonics means that Noah and the ark and the creatures on board could not survive. A third point is the text tells us that man was local. Man was not global at that time, he was local. God gives a command to Adam to fill the earth. He repeats that command to Noah, but in much sharper language. In fact, it's in the same context where he commands Noah that he must stop the expression of murder. After all, that was the problem existing before the flood. A minimum of 19 out of 20 people were dying a death of murder. And God needed to see that stopped, and so He dealt with mankind to see that it would be stopped, getting rid of the reprobates, and then giving a command to Noah to restrain this expression of murder so that this wouldn't repeat. But in the same context, He says, you must fill the earth. Because if man remains local and united, he will always unite for evil. He will not unite for good. So please spread yourselves throughout the earth and remain separate from one another. Well, we realize that Noah didn't obey that command either, and God had to forcibly scatter the inhabitants over the face of the earth, the story of Nimrod in chapters 10 and 11. So it tells us that mankind was local. We also realize that we have no geographical place names until chapter 11 for any region outside of the environs of Mesopotamia. Now, as far as the excrement problem goes, if you read through the 4 chapters of Genesis, you will note that all the references to animals are references to soulish animals. We're not talking 10 million species of life. We're only talking birds and mammals. In fact, the Hebrew noun basar makes it more specific than that. Birds and mammals that have had significant contact with humanity. Those are the only species that Noah was to bring on board the ark. Therefore, we're probably talking the high hundreds or the low thousands in terms of pairs and animals. And given that the ark was the size of a small aircraft carrier, it would be plenty big enough to house all the creatures and food. They wouldn't even have to hibernate. You could feed them easily for a full year, and 8 people can shovel fast enough to keep up with them. And this is in context with the theme of judgment you see throughout the whole of the Bible. Namely, that man's sin, man's offenses against God, have no impact on animals other than the soulish animals. The Levitical law points out that man's sin has limits in terms of its impact. It has no effect on the cockroaches, but it can have significant effect upon cows, pigs, horses, dogs, and cats. And so those species that had that kind of contact with man were included in the judgment of the flood. Those animals, like the penguins that had no contact with man, were left alone. So I don't believe there were penguins on board the ark. Since they had no contact with man, since man had not yet visited Antarctica, Noah did not have to take 2 penguins on board the ark. But he probably took 2 sheep and 2 cow, etc. Now, what about this absurd notion that the Bible tells us that the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat? After all, CBS television aired a big special, a 2-hour special, on the search for Noah's ark on top of Mount Ararat. I wish they had read the text more carefully. The text does not say that Noah's ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. It says it came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, using that same Hebrew noun har. Keep in mind there's only one Hebrew noun for geologic relief. These mountains of Ararat encompass a region of 150,000 square miles. Armenians have been referring to this as a geographical place for thousands of years. What does it encompass? A map here of the Mesopotamian floodplain shows this region called the Mountains of Ararat. And it extends all the way down to the floodplain just north of Nineveh. So in my opinion, Noah and the ark, as the waters were receding, the ark came to rest on these foothills of Ararat just north of Nineveh, which means it's hopeless to search for Noah's ark. The text tells us it was made out of gopher wood. Nobody has a clue what gopher wood is. Well, we have one clue. We know if the ark was constructed of oak, it wouldn't have the structural strength to sustain a 1-year voyage. It's simply too big. And indeed, oak boats that have been built here in the U.S. got up to about 350 feet maximum. That's about the stretching the limits of the structural strength of oak. But there are other woods that you could get that could easily be used to make a boat 450 feet long. But that kind of wood, you're usually talking tropical gumwoods. The problem with that kind of wood is it's rather expensive. Even in the context of thousands of years ago, we would expect those timbers to have considerable value, especially in the region of Mesopotamia. And therefore would not be realistic that these Mesopotamians building their cities right after the flood would leave that lumber sitting there in the foothills. They would have taken a journey up there and grabbed that lumber and brought it south to Nineveh to help build the city. And since that city's been burnt to the ground 6 times minimum, all we can expect to find today are the ashes of the lumber of Noah's Ark. And therefore I'm encouraging Christians to stop trying to fund expeditions to Mount Ararat. It's a waste of time, a waste of money, and I can suggest much better places for them to invest their giving dollars. Which brings up the issue of where did Cain get his wife? That's the last one I'll discuss before opening up for questions. And that's the 8th most frequent objection we hear about the Christian faith. Adam and Eve had